All right, welcome back, everybody. This is Ian, and today let's go over some ideas and principles surrounding speaking activities. The ideas that I present today are ones that I gleaned from this book right here called Grammar Practice Activities by Penny this book came out in the late 1980s, but yet I still find some of the ideas and practices and advice useful to this day. So, according to a good language practice task has both a very clear objective, and B, it has active language use. So when talks about the language activity having a clear objective, she's talking about a tangible result, something that will occur so that a student knows that they have completed something. So, for example, perhaps they have produced a role play in which each person speaks 5 times. That is measurable, and it is clear when the students are finished. And finally, the objective should be simple to articulate. Finally, I wanted to bring up a quick passage that I thought was very interesting. Writes, if the main objective, however, is to get some non linguistic result, the task is usually much more interesting and has a lot more learning value. By this, I think she means rather than telling students to make 5 sentences using the conditional, ask them to describe 5 counterfactual situations based on maybe 5 given prompts. If I had $1 million, if school was canceled today, blah, blah, blah. This is non linguistic because the goal is to communicate an idea, not just to use a language structure. And finally, a good language activity necessitates active language use. So when it talks about active language use, it breaks down into 2 components, volume and repetition. In terms of volume, solid language activity should allow students to produce a lot of language. As puts it, we should make sure that the activity is in fact based mainly on using language and does not waste too much time on mime, artistic creation, or silent brain racking. She goes on to say, we need to be aware of what is really going on, to keep a careful eye on how much they are actually engaging with the language they are supposed to be practicing. I do really enjoy the use of gesture and acting, so I think is just saying that we should also be mindful that these actions translate into language use and communication and is not something that students simply have fun doing for its own sake. And a good language activity involves repetition. In terms of repetition, this means that it gives students the opportunity to repeat a given target structure many different times, hopefully within the context of a non linguistic objective. Likes to write a lot about student interest. I think a big factor of whether or not a language activity will be successful is if students are motivated or interested in what is going on. And points to both open endedness and personalization as 2 big components to hopefully raise student interest. In terms of open endedness, we're talking about responses that allow students to supply their own responses of any length that they wish. So rather than saying you have to fill in one word blank, that's more of a closed ended. It's something that allows us students of higher level to make more complex utterances and students of lower level to produce shorter utterances. But that is up to the student, not just based on the structure of the activity. And then talks a lot about personalization. Here is one example of how an activity lacks personalization. I found this in a activity book called Shenanigans, in which the activity describes Carol's Day. In this activity, one student has a list of activities that Carol does on a given day, and the other student has to put the pictures in order. It's a kind of listening activity. However, The only problem I have with this activity, it sounds great, but who the hell is Carol? I don't know. My students don't know, and nobody cares. Another way to change this would be to have students very briefly at first write down their own schedule, maybe 4 events that they would like to do on a perfect day. And then students can ask each other questions about, oh, what are you doing at 2 o'clock? Or, oh, what are you doing after lunch? You could also leave blank spaces to allow students to invite each other to parties. I did this once in class, and students seemed to have a really good time mingling and asking each other, oh, can you go to my party, Yeonju? Oh no, I'm so sorry. I'm going to Gichan's party at 2 o'clock, but what about at 4 o'clock? It's just a way to allow students to sort of insert themselves into the activity rather than doing an activity around some fictional character that they might not even know about. Solid speaking activities can also introduce pleasurable tension. This is another way to ratchet up motivation. So, this can mean that the activity itself is a game, but doesn't necessarily have to be. There should also be, because there could also just be some kind of goal in mind. So, for example, maybe your task is to write 10 sentences using comparatives. You could also introduce time constraints to add a little bit of tension. Okay, now write as many comparative sentences as you can in 5 minutes. Or you could also even have a little bit of implicit competition, not necessarily something for the sake of winning, but something for the sake of trying to outdo yourself, trying to compete against your own limitations. For example, okay, everybody, we have 6 groups. Let's see who can write the most comparative sentences in 5 minutes. All of these are ways to add pleasurable tension or urgency to a language activity. In her book, writes about the idea of pace, but she specifically says that pace is different from speed. The way that she defines it, if an exercise has pace, it means that the class is occupied with a steady flow of interesting stimuli to respond to, together with a feeling of constant progress towards the objective of the activity. If, however, there are frequent interruptions, delays, or digressions, the pace will flag, and the activity produce less volume of language practice and all of the problems associated with boredom. So in this case, pace doesn't mean that the activity is moving very quickly in terms of speed, but it means that students are consistently able to produce different volumes of language and continually make progress towards a given goal. So pace is a little bit more about steadiness of engagement rather than speed of progress. So pace is something to keep in mind as you design or execute your lessons. Finally, we'll talk about some different speaking activity mechanics that describes in her book. In teacher student exchange, a teacher will ask questions or make requests to a whole class setting, which is a very common method of teaching. But as writes, there is usually, except in the case of extended performances, a high proportion of teacher talk, hence relatively little language production by the learners. So teacher student exchange can be good for a basic introduction or very brief tidbits of checking answers, but maybe not a mechanic to rely on too often. The converse of that would be a student teacher exchange. This is a kind of reverse ping pong where students will initiate the exchange. They will ask questions to the teacher instead of perhaps the other way around. Another concept that we've actually practiced in the past is the chain. In a chain, this allows students to build upon each other's answers. So rather than using the teacher as a conduit of communication, students are able to run the communication through each other. For example, what do you like doing in your free time, Gichan? I like dancing. What do you like to do in your free time, Jihyun? I like to play tennis. What do you like to do in your free time, Sehyun? And so on. Rather than the teacher asking and the teacher receiving an answer, the teacher asking another person, the chain runs through the students themselves. Fluid pairs. This is a method in which students will do a brief exchange with one partner and then immediately switch to another partner. Some people like to do this mechanic in an activity called circle pairs, in which there are two circles, one in the middle and one on the outside. And the students in the middle, after a very brief language exchange, will rotate one person to the right, almost like the concept of speed dating, but in a language classroom. This will allow different students to practice the language with many different people and will make lead to a lot of varied interaction pattern and student centered activities. And finally, semi controlled small group transactions. This serves as what Earth calls the kind of skeleton of a dialogue. So small groups might sit together and they might have a question, but rather than just having some kind of free talking exchange in which students might feel intimidated or where one student might dominate the discussion, semi controlled is just like that. It's controlled. As says, the language to be produced by students is semi controlled. That is to say, they are told to make use of certain patterns or kinds of sentences, but the exact content is left up to them. So this can be done in examples of sentence stems, or perhaps something that says dot 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 that students can supply their own content, but the teacher is able to supply the target grammar structures. Okay, that's all I have for today. Hopefully, this didn't take too long, but I appreciate your consistent effort and attention, and I look forward to seeing you in class next time. Until then, cheers.